Welcome to the third dimension. For nearly 3 weeks, Israel has been pounding the Gaza Strip with airstrikes with the political and financial support of the United States. 8,000 Palestinians have been killed in Israeli airstrikes. Most of those killed are children. The civilian deaths in Gaza, already outrageously high due to the relentless bombing by Israel occupation, will be unimaginable during this ground operation that began on October the 27th. Gaza, already a ruin, will be left a cemetery. In the meantime, many Western leaders have rushed to Tel Aviv and pledged their full-throated support for Israel. The United States moved aircraft carriers, ships and jets to the eastern Mediterranean and promised to give Israel additional equipment and ammunition. To discuss the Israeli occupation war on Gaza, join me from London, Sara Wellington. Sara is a political activist and a journalist focusing on Palestine. She's been a supporter of Palestine for nearly 50 years and a vocal, proactive campaigner since the first Intifada. Sara, welcome to the program.
Thank you.
If we would start straight away, Sara, okay, how would you describe the Israeli genocides in Gaza now?
Actually, indescribable. What we're witnessing is, I think, for this generation, and for me as well, is possibly one of the worst genocides I've ever seen. And the reason that is because we have access to real-time footage. During the Rwandan genocide, which I think 150,000 people were slaughtered when the French peacekeepers moved out, we didn't have real-time footage. We didn't have the information coming in on our phones 24/7. So I think that for me, this is something that could have been avoided. It's something that we are watching day to day. We are seeing the misery and the suffering unfold literally before our very eyes. So it's a multiple faceted genocide. And I think we need to be careful when we're asking just for a ceasefire, because a ceasefire kind of implies that it's a temporary measure. I think really what we should be pushing for is sort of a three-factor. It's the end, as a ceasefire, is an end to the Israeli ethnic cleansing of Palestine as a whole, and an end to the Israeli occupation. And I think we just need to be careful that when we push for this ceasefire, that we make sure that it involves all of those things.
Yeah.
Because a temporary ceasefire where the bombing stops for 4 or 5 days, you've got raw sewage flowing into the streets of Gaza, the infection, disease and sepsis, all of these things are going to happen in the time post a ceasefire. And so in some senses, that's a secondary genocide, cutting electricity, and also cutting the telecommunications. That's another form of genocide in that people who were under the rubble could have rung rescue teams, could have informed their relatives that they were there. And some of those people, thousands of those people, are still under the rubble because their phones were dead. So also cutting fuel so that ambulances, excavators, tractors, all types of heavy machinery that the defense crews were using to excavate people from the rubble no longer work. So this is a multiple faceted genocide of the worst proportions.
Okay. Now, as we're talking about this genocide and civilian casualties, Sara, okay, and most of them are children. Just today, Save the Children organization reported that the number of children killed in Gaza during the Israeli occupation military campaign over the past 3 weeks has surpassed the annual number of children killed in armed conflict globally in each of the past 4 years. How do you comment on this?
Yeah, I read that report as well, and I think it's collectively more children have been killed in 3 weeks than collectively all of the world conflicts. It's the most appalling devastating genocide, isn't it? We are talking of half the population of Gaza are children, half are refugees. You know, this is, if you bomb an area the size of about 20 football pitches, and you know that half the population are children, then you intentionally know that you are going to kill thousands and thousands of children. And I think that just makes it all the more appalling that the Israelis are being facilitated, assisted even by the Biden administration to continue their genocide. And the veto of the ceasefire was a death sentence for these children. And every single day, we're seeing more and more traumatized, terrorized children and babies being pulled from the rubble without their parents or without their brothers and sisters, children having their limbs amputated without anesthesia. Now, if you can imagine the horror of having your leg or your arms amputated because they're mutilated by the bombing without anesthetic. I mean, in this day and age, we possibly can't imagine what that might be. It's something that maybe we expect from sort of medieval historic stories, but actually knowing that children on the floor are being operated on, it's absolutely horrendous. And the fact that the ceasefire was vetoed in itself should be seen as a war crime. Yeah. So the assistance that not only Britain, but France and Canada and all of the other countries and the United States, especially, are giving the Israelis to facilitate this genocide makes it all the worse.
Yeah. In fact, I was planning to ask you this question, Sarah, okay? When Western countries keep lecturing about human rights and all these things, okay? And then we have seen their unconditional support to Israel, okay? So what is your understanding to this, Sarah?
I think we finish the myth somehow that, Western society is a bastion for human rights, that we are the defenders of human rights. We're not. We've assisted in a genocide. And so, we can debunk that, sorry, my computer. We can debunk the idea that Western civilization is Western civilization. We are assisting in the most heinous genocide that I have witnessed in my life. And it's not what it says it is. I think that they have just fallen over themselves to be as pro-Israel as possible, knowing, and I do think leaders know that this is the most awful form of ethnic cleansing. I don't think Biden truly believed that he didn't believe in the death toll. I think they are somehow scrabbling to find a reason how they can justify not coming in and intervening and preventing this merciless killing of Palestinian civilians. And these are civilians. They are not attacking Hamas. We know that these are civilians. They are children and women and men. And we are no longer a bastion of human rights.
Okay, so you talked about President Biden, okay, suspecting the figures coming from Gaza, okay? And this also leads me to the question, okay, we've been for a long time hearing about what we call prestigious media institutions like the BBC, Fox News, Sky News, all these things, okay? How do you interpret the fall of those institutions by adopting the Israeli narrative, Sarah?
Well, those who side with the Israelis, I think, will be remembered as being on the wrong side of history. But Britain and the BBC have been here before with apartheid South Africa. They were also on the wrong side of history. People very conveniently forget that their favorite news channel was biased or was not balanced or was siding with the wrong side. So I think the BBC will probably get away with it. The majority of the British people still watch the BBC knowing that it's biased. But I think things are changing. A lot of people have got rid of their TV licenses. A lot of people no longer watch that. They watch Al Jazeera, but they've also got their own phones. Everyone is a journalist now. So when we see news coming in from Gaza, and it completely contradicts what the BBC are saying or the stance that the BBC are taking, then, you know, more and more people are starting to challenge the rhetoric that's coming from the BBC. But also there's another thing to remember here is that this generation, the younger generation, have now Palestinian friends and Palestinian connections that they didn't have, say, 50 years ago. There are so many Palestinian students and postgraduates in Britain who've either returned to Gaza or have made deep connections with people in Britain. So the Palestinian narrative is inside campuses. People are more connected to the Palestinian people. They have literally been impacted this time by this genocide, as opposed to other massacres that the Israelis have committed, because they have friends, relatives, friends of families and colleagues, even partners that live in Gaza. So now they have a deep connection. What the BBC is saying no longer makes sense. So
okay. Talking about this Palestinian narrative in the Western countries, Sarah, okay, this also would lead us to the huge rallies that erupted in London, for instance, in Madrid, in the DC, and in many cities around the world. How do you comment on such rallies, Sarah?
Well, again, you know, over 500,000 people took to the streets in Britain. I'm very proud of British people. And again, it's across the world as well. But again, it's to do with the fact that we have deeper connections with the Palestinian people. We have network connections, WhatsApp connections. We are much more, you know, we are one and the same. We are all Palestinians, basically. So I think that now, then when the streets come out and are filled in London full of people rallying for the Palestinian cause, they no longer want to sit on the sidelines. They have risen from their armchairs and they've come out to stop a genocide. And the chasm between us and our politicians, the gap between the will of the people and what our politicians are coming out with, is enormous. We are all politically homeless while our leaders are supporting genociders.
And you think the masses in the West, Sarah, would in the end of the day fill this gap you refer to?
Not necessarily. I think the gap between us and our politicians, we do have to put pressure on the government, but we have a very pro-Israeli government, a very stubborn government, a very racist government that is actually facilitating the making of Israeli weapons on British soil. They are invested in the Israeli war industry. They make money from every single bombing campaign that the Israelis commit. Whether we can persuade politicians who are actually physically invested in making money from the Israeli war industry to change sides is, well, you know, time will tell, but I think it's unlikely. We have to vote out these people, but it's too late for the people of Gaza. We've allowed this to happen. We've allowed people to get into parliament who basically are racist, supremacists. And so now we are stuck with a government that doesn't speak for its people. Whether we can fill that gap in time to save Palestine is another question altogether.
Okay. Some observers, Sarah, in the same context, they say, okay, in fact, the Palestinians are in war not only with Israel, but with the West. And here they mean the Western governments who support Israel. In fact, you must have followed with me how the Israeli representative in the United Nations attacked the United Nations Secretary General in the same meeting of that United Nations General Assembly and also in the United Nations Security Council, okay? How do you understand or how do you read this kind of Israeli arrogance towards such a prestigious world organization?
Look, the Israelis have never abided by international law, humanitarian law. They have violated every single rights of the Child Convention. They have never listened to any UN resolution, respected any UN resolution. To be honest with you, Antonio Guterres has been quite slow and quite weak with some of his statements. But when he does say something that the Israelis don't like, then they're quick to condemn him. Well, obviously, because they're the war criminals. They're the ones committing heinous war crimes. So the attack against Antonio Guterres and the Portuguese envoy as well, I think that was expected, but I don't think that it will lead to Israeli leaders ending up in The Hague. There are people talking about convicting Israeli leaders for war crimes. I think, we don't get ahead of ourselves. It's never happened before. We're still waiting for the war crimes the Israelis committed in 2014 to be brought to The Hague. So I think it's just talk, and it's just a way of the Israelis trying to convince the people that this is justified. No genocide is justified. Has never been. And to try and justify the killing of women and children and to attack the United Nations as some way is going to make a difference, I think shows you the weakness of the Israeli regime and the fact that it's already crumbling.
Okay. As we are talking about the United Nations role in this crisis, Sarah, we're expecting the UN Security Council to have a meeting today, emergency meeting, and again, the UAE representing the Arab group will propose a resolution for ceasefire. Do you think such a session will bring out something?
It worries me, the ceasefire. Unless the ceasefire involves the end of the Israeli occupation, the end of ethnic cleansing, and a Palestinian state, then I think actually that even if they manage to get a ceasefire on the table, we're looking at 5 or 6 days before the Israelis will resume bombing. They're still destroying Jenin. They've attacked several places in central Palestine today. They are still on an ethnic cleansing campaign. They've started to bulldoze areas north of Gaza, although it's only on the outskirts of the border and just inside the borders. You're looking at an intent to ethnically cleanse. A ceasefire may bring some small amount of humanitarian aid. It may give the Palestinians some respite from the bombing, but unless they provide the hospitals with the correct medical aid and they restore fuel and they restore electricity and power and they mend the water infrastructure, then we're still looking at a travesty. We're still looking at a secondary genocide when the disease and sickness and infection sets in. Also, they're starving, they're searching for water, they're drinking sewage water. It's not going to take long, despite a ceasefire, for a secondary genocide to go into effect. So really, we want an end to the Israeli occupation. That is what is needed. That's it is vital. And it just worries me that the focus on only a ceasefire will ignore the fact of why the whole incident on October the 7th began.
Okay. With that remark, we come to the end of this interview, Sarah. Thank you so much for talking to Yemen Today TV, and thank you so much for your insights.
Thank you for inviting me.
Thank you. That's all for this time. See you next week with a new edition of The Third Dimension.